So we've got Christy's PowerPoint up, and we'll include it in the slides for the organization. Christy's the research director at the National League of Cities. She's been working for the last few years on urban-rural bridging issues. How do we connect small places with big places, and also working for the National League of Cities. You deal with elected officials all the time who are trying to figure out how to make their communities better. So Christy's up in that corner. I think the volume is good. Carly's going to be clicking for her since we are using a different system this morning. And Christy, when I asked Christy to do this, she was like, "Oh, great, I get to come down to Danville. This is going to be so much fun." And so the better laid plans of rain and men. So this morning, Christy McFarland, welcome to our group.
Great, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here virtually. I would have loved to have been there in person, but thank you for the invitation, and it's great to talk with all of you about the work that we're doing at National League of Cities. So before I get too much further, I often get the question when I talk about urban-rural issues, why is the National League of Cities talking about this issue? Don't you just represent sort of large places, the New Yorks, LAs, Chicagos? And that couldn't be further from the truth. We work with cities large and small, many places that are quite rural in nature as well. And elected officials from all these different types of cities are looking for solutions to improve their communities. So this was really a vital issue for us. We also work very closely with our state organizations, which are the state municipal leagues. Some of you may be familiar with the Virginia Municipal League. And each year we do a project with our state municipal leagues to really uncover what are the pressing issues for them at the state level that they're seeing in the communities and states across the country. And this issue around the urban-rural divide really rose to the surface over the past couple of years as a challenge that's growing, but also a challenge that tends to be misunderstood. And that really was the impetus for this project. So before I go too much further, Carly, if you want to advance the slide, just a quick note about the National League of Cities and the Center for City Solutions, which is where I sit. For those of you who don't know, the National League of Cities is the oldest and largest organization representing municipal governments across the United States. We do federal advocacy, but that's not where I sit. I sit in our Center for City Solutions, which is focused on applied research, best practices and solutions, as well as technical assistance and leadership education for city leaders across the country. We do a wide range of research and issues, everything that affects municipal governments, from economic development, finance, infrastructure. We also have a growing portfolio on issues of local democracy, and I think that may have been something you all have talked about. At least it was in one of the articles that the organizers had sent out around the issues of local control and preemption, and what that means for the capacity of cities and local governments to improve the quality of life in the local economies in their region. So that's become a large issue for us. So that's me. That's the National League of Cities. And with that, I think we can get right into it. So Carly, if you want to advance the slide. Again, as I mentioned, the issue around urban-rural divide really surfaced from conversations that we at the National League of Cities were having with our members, with our state, also with our state representatives who represent cities across the country. And the key there really was that the general national narrative about urban-rural divide is that rural communities are devoid of economic potential and opportunity, and that urban areas have all-consuming growth. And in my experience with elected officials and with cities, when any issue is presented as that black and white and that straightforward, that's the area to do more digging and more research, because there's so many shades of gray when it comes to critical issues around economies. So with the understanding that having a narrative of urban and rural areas are completely isolated from each other and pitted against each other in political, cultural, and economic terms is not helpful. It's divisive. It's not accurate. or meaningful, and at worst, it hinders opportunities, really economic opportunities for urban and rural communities to find common ground and to pursue a shared economic future. So that was our hope for this report, to really sort of reclaim the narrative, put a spotlight on rural communities, and also put a spotlight on those areas where urban and rural communities are connecting with each other. You can go to the next slide, Carly. So the overview for the presentation today, I'll talk a little bit about what is urban and rural. I think everyone has their own definitions, but I'll talk a little bit about how we define urban and rural for the sake of this report. And then I'll talk a little bit about the particular metrics and measures that we analyzed for this research, specifically around economic divides, and then opportunities that we surfaced for bridging these divides. So before we move to the next slide, just quickly, in terms of how we define urban and rural, we know that the Office of Management and Budget uses definitions of metro versus non-metro. We also know that 20% of rural communities are in metropolitan areas. So although from a data perspective, using metro versus non-metro to represent urban and rural is sometimes sort of an easier path forward, we know that that's not necessarily reflective of urban and rural communities overall. This report in particular uses the census definition, which is based on population size, density, land use, and distance to an urban area. The county is the level of analysis, and particularly for Virginia, where there's independent cities, the independent cities are used as the county proxies. And the census also has mostly rural and completely rural as two separate categories, but for the sake of this research, we combine them, again, because this was in collaboration with our state partners, and we did need to do sort of state level analysis in terms of urban and rural. So that was our decision there. Throughout the presentation, and Carl, you can go to the next slide. Throughout the presentation, you'll see varying shades of green and purple on the maps. For each of the measures I discussed, we calculated the difference between urban and rural areas. So if a state is shaded green, it means that rural areas have a stronger outcome than urban areas on that measure. If it's purple, it means that urban areas have a stronger outcome, and the darker the shade, the more pronounced the divergence in outcomes, and faint colors indicate a narrower divide. So on population, when we look at population divide, again, and just to step back a minute, for this analysis, we assessed population divides, as well as broadband access, and then we look at a few other measures that are more specific to economic development. So I'll talk about those in just a minute. Turning to population, when we apply the definition that we do with the census, we see that only 4 states have greater rural versus urban populations. Again, confirming what we know about urban areas as population centers. But of course, this does not account for the vast number of states in which land area is primarily rural, right? Turning to broadband access, and I'll just note on, you don't need to turn back, Carly, but on population for Virginia, it was a very dark shade of purple, indicating mostly urban, and with the recent announcement of Amazon's HQ2 in Northern Virginia, I sense that will just get darker purple for Virginia, but that's something I think to talk about in just a minute too. Turning to broadband access, again, confirming what we know about the urban-rural divide. In all states across the country, broadband access is higher in urban areas than in rural areas. You'll also notice dots on this map in particular. The dots indicate states that have above average on broadband access. So above the national average in terms of the percentage of residents with broadband access. The state of Virginia overall has higher than average broadband access, with urban-rural divide, again, favoring urban areas. But again, I know in Danville, Virginia, with municipal broadband, you all are very well positioned to leverage that asset for economic development. Moving to education. Similar to broadband, urban attainment tends to be higher in states throughout the country. We see some particular places like Utah and Virginia that have higher rural attainment. This likely is due to the high density of rural universities. Also, lack of broadband obviously plays out in terms of lack of educational opportunities in some rural communities. And, similar again in Virginia with urban areas having higher attainment. So in addition to some of the traditional measures of the urban-rural divide around education and broadband, which I think we know by and large, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper on some specific indicators of economic development. So the first one that we examined is high-value business growth. So we're looking specifically at the growth in the number of businesses in traded sectors. So looking at businesses that are exporting outside of the region and bringing in new money into the region. And these are also businesses that tend to pay higher wages. So we're looking from the time period, the post-recession time period between 2010 and 2015. So growth from 2010 to 2015 in the number of businesses in traded sectors or that export outside of the region. Again, we call these high value. They're bringing money into the area. They connect the area with regional, state, and global economies, and they do tend to pay higher wages. Interestingly, on this factor, rural areas in 15 out of 45 states in our analysis have stronger growth in high-value businesses than urban areas. Although there was faster growth in the number of exporting businesses in more urban parts of Virginia, some of the largest exports in the state, like coal and soybeans, are from rural communities. So we know, when we're seeing a stronger rural growth in high-value businesses, it tends to be natural resource based. Next slide. This next measure is prosperity growth, and prosperity is the percentage of contributions to state GDP. So we're looking at the growth again from 2010 to 2015 in growth in urban and rural contributions to state GDP. We know that exports tend to be a key driver of state GDP. Surprisingly, 25 out of 45 states, including Virginia, rural areas have stronger prosperity growth than urban areas of the state. So I think that's a pretty significant finding that rural areas really are driving state GDP in most states across the country. So in summary, we found that rural communities continue to struggle with some foundational elements like education and broadband. And that tends to be the case for Virginia, but of course, Danville has a leg up in some of these measures. Rural areas in many states outpace their urban counterparts, again in growth of contributions to state GDP. Many rural areas also outpace urban growth of businesses that export regionally and globally. What this tells us really is that market connections matter for rural growth. Additionally, those states that experience the most post-recession growth overall also have narrower urban-rural divides. And what this tells us is that we grow stronger when we grow together, that the economic connections between urban and rural really matter. So when we think about how do we get there, how do we strengthen these connections going forward, we did a little bit of digging. We spoke to some smart people like Ted Abernathy and others to get a sense of what can communities do to help bridge the urban-rural divide. So we know that rural areas are driving state economies across the country in some regards. We know that that urban cores continue to get a larger share of, at least attract a larger share of the economic growth. So how do we think about urban and rural in terms of a shared economic future as opposed to how they grow distinctly? So with that, actually, Carly, if you want to switch to the next slide. So I'll just talk a little bit about 3 strategies that we uncovered in some of our scans of places across the country, again, in terms of our conversations. And some of these may be ones that you all are exploring in the Danville area as well. So strategies that we've uncovered for bridging the urban-rural divide, rural linkages to urban clusters, urban linkages to rural clusters and rural entrepreneurship and urban markets. I think the core here really is the understanding that in order for rural communities to grow, there also needs to be an industrial base. So when you have issues of education and workforce development and talent development and broadband access, these obviously are core foundational assets that must be present in order for regions to grow. And there also has to be the industrial pillars that are going to align with these assets in order to continue to grow the economy. So with that, although of course workforce development, those other assets are critically important, the focus here is primarily on those industrial drivers that can then be aligned with those strategies as well. So looking at rural communities linking to urban clusters of activity, rural communities can position themselves as prime locations for manufacturers and suppliers that serve urban businesses through value chains. And there may also be aspects of a rural workforce that are well aligned with nearby urban clusters. I'll leave it to the experts in the room, economic leadership in particular. They've done some really great work in the Growth and Diversity Plan for Go Virginia Region 3, but thinking specifically about clusters that are well aligned in the Danville area to other places like Charlotte, for example, whether it's production technology, food processing and manufacturing, and so forth. In terms of the next strategy, urban communities linking to rural clusters of economic activity, we're seeing this primarily in resource extraction industries. For example, urban areas that are in heavily rural states with economies based in resource extraction, like North Dakota, are growing their service economy by providing legal, financial, trade, transportation services, as well as technology innovations to rural parts of the state that are focused on the production elements. Similar in the Sacramento region, agricultural production creates a significant amount of jobs in processing and distribution in urban parts of the region. And I know in Danville, there's been a specific focus as well on forestry and the potential there for production of forestry in more rural parts with value-added product development, design, and distribution in more urban parts of the region. So that seems like an area for exploration as well. The next strategy that we explored is rural entrepreneurship. Of course, urban markets serve as a core market for rural entrepreneurs, but we also did some digging into a study that was conducted in Oregon of rural hops growers, which is a very interesting study. They found that rural hops growers not only rely on urban parts of the state for their market, but also to create, test, and refine niche products that can then be exported outside of the region to a global market. So for example, rural hops growers in Oregon rely on sophisticated palette of craft beer consumers in Portland to help them innovate their product and stay ahead of trends. Because of this relationship between urban and rural, not only for the urban market to serve as sort of the landing spot for rural products, but also as sort of the testing grounds for rural products, the state has become one of the top hop producers in the United States. So I thought that was sort of an interesting twist on the rural entrepreneurship connections with urban markets as well. So, in terms of wrapping this up, what we were hoping to accomplish from this study is just to lay the groundwork that there is more to explore in the urban-rural divide, and that it is worthwhile to build those connections and to seek those connections so that urban and rural communities can grow together, particularly when there are strengths either in the urban area or in the rural area that really can accelerate regional and state growth together. So with that, I will end and take any questions.
Thank you. One of the things that Christy mentioned was the way we were looking at clusters in urban-rural areas, and our firm worked with the league on this idea that, 15, 20 years ago, cluster analysis was this magic box, and Michael Porter had it hidden behind a wall, and it was hard to get the data on. Today, you can do cluster analysis in about 10 minutes on anywhere. but it doesn't mean much, because in rural areas, you just sort of get a picture that everybody already knew that, yes, I have a big one of these and that looks like a cluster. What we try to look at is how all the places around a smaller community impact it. So for this area, when you look at it, Charlottesville has an impact, Raleigh-Durham has an impact, Greensboro has an impact, Richmond has an impact, and so how you look at supply chains around clusters became sort of the deep data nerd way of thinking about it that we looked at. So that was the point that she was trying to reference. The connectivity is the key, and in smaller places, y'all know that already, but we have a few minutes for questions, and what I'm going to do today is if you ask a question, I'll repeat it from here. Christy can hear it, and then she'll be able to help us with that. So questions for Christy at the League or the research they've done? Yes?
I'd like to thank you, Christy, and I just want to go a little bit deeper around connectivity. Could you tell us things people have done in different places to better build those connective linkages between rural and urban areas, to see them, identify them, and figure out what to do about them?
And Christy, a theme for ours has been this idea that intentional connection takes some work. And so the question was, have you seen places that have really built some of this urban rural connectivity, and could you give an example or two of how they've done it?
Sure. Yes. I would say one place in particular is in Minnesota. There are a couple of organizations that are focused specifically on building economic growth and economic connections by expanding broadband access into more rural parts of the state. That has been an extremely collaborative effort. There have been also, to accelerate that effort, there have been grants from the state that have intersected with the plans, the regional plans in Minnesota. And I'd love to, obviously provide more information and contact information if you all are interested in that in particular. Again, and actually, I mean, even here in Virginia, and Ted, you can speak to this probably better than I can, but thinking about the Go Virginia process, and the efforts at the state level to support the efforts at the regional level to really help bridge the urban-rural divide, by looking at things like the cluster analysis that you provided. There are a lot of efforts. I know Virginia Tech, for example, is currently leading some efforts through their extension offices to help build those connections between urban and rural communities, particularly in terms of entrepreneurship.
Some areas, just like in Virginia, have started the idea of offering, I don't want to be rude, but a bribe for everybody to work together nicer. Here's some money. Some of you foundation people in the room know how this works. Here's some money, but you got to do it this way. You got to work together. You've got to, get along, plan together, do those things. We're seeing more of that. Both states doing that, but also a lot of foundation work where you're encouraging collaboration with resources. Any other questions for Christy? Was that a whistle from me? No, that was a phone, right? Somebody whistled. I don't know. That's interesting. All right, one last one for me before we let you go today. Again, thank you for trying to brave the rain last night. We do appreciate it and have you here. Do you see any regional differences on this? We're looking at maps that show the West looking really different than it used to. We've got people in the room from, I think I counted yesterday, 17 different states. So different places are doing different things. Are you seeing any themes or places that are more passionate about this, more doing it differently around the country?
Yeah, and I think the focus tends to be different too. So, for example, in states that have a lot of where the state economy is driven by natural resource extraction or agriculture, I think we're seeing better collaboration because there's more consciousness about the value of rural communities, I think, in those states. Even in urban states like California that also have very rural parts of the state, like Sacramento, for example, we're seeing that there's a lot of urban-rural strategies to leverage the agricultural production that's happening in the rural communities. So I think we're seeing it in the West a little bit more. We're seeing it in the Northwest, and particularly when it comes to broadband infrastructure, I think that's where we're seeing a lot of efforts in the Midwest. Again, I particularly referenced some communities also in Minnesota. So I think it depends on the region of the country in terms of how they're approaching it, what their particular challenges and struggles are. When they're thinking about the urban-rural divide, some are focused on foundational elements, but they have sort of the bigger economic picture in mind.
Okay, so I'm going to try something. I'm going to turn this camera around so y'all can all wave goodbye to Christy. And if I unplug it, then thank you, and we'll say goodbye.
Okay, awesome.
All right, here we go. Wow. Everybody wave goodbye to Christy. What do you think? Pretty cool? All right.
Awesome. Wish I was there with you guys.
Thank you all very much. Thanks, Christy. I appreciate it. All right.
Thank you.
All right, 30-second interlude for technology shift.